Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Jaffe. I am the director of the Baker Institute Energy Forum. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. I am excited to see my second day faces, so hopefully you found yesterday's session very interesting. We are very excited to start the session today. We were joking in the lobby as I was arriving. I would not be here today speaking to you, but for the fact that I became the protege of our first keynote speaker, who taught me everything I know. And he is a brilliant, he was originally a brilliant professor at Princeton, and then a brilliant member of the team in the US government that worked on the International Energy Agency. And now he's a gillionaire working as the managing director and head of commodity global research at Credit Suisse. But he has had many different jobs. He has been in similar positions at Lehman Brothers and Louis Capital Markets. He has been the publisher of Petroleum Intelligence Weekly at the time that I worked there, and we had a wonderful team. And I was joking that if you're doing investments or you are needing advice on natural gas or any countless thing in the oil industry today, there are maybe 20 or 30 people who are at the top of this field who were trained by Edward Morse. So he really has made a contribution beyond his own work and his own writing. We see him quoted widely in all kinds of magazines. He's always writing provocative articles in Foreign Affairs, always ahead of the trend when it comes to what's coming up, and always a very important advocate either of interesting U.S. policies or critics of stupid U.S. policies. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing his remarks today. And you all can't see, but I can see the very funny title he has for his presentation. And so I'm looking forward to introducing him and hearing Dr. Edward Morse.
Thanks very much. Those of you who know Amy know that she's not prone to exaggerate about anything. And those who know her also know that she likes to get other people in trouble, put them in difficult circumstances, politically, personally, all kinds of ways. But it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have said yes to Amy's invitation that I address you this morning. I will try to live up a little bit modestly to her introduction. We'll see. She's asked me to talk about the subjects that you've been talking about yesterday and today. I apologize for not having been here yesterday or last night. The weather was part of the reason I couldn't make it. And I know I'm using the wrong instrument. Okay. I know that a lot of what has been discussed and a lot of the material that has been circulated on this really wonderful study that the Baker Institute is putting together talks about the unintended consequences of policy. In that regard, it's a pleasure always to be at the Baker Institute, which I regard as probably the most innovative energy policy research institute in the world. I wanted to start with Macondo. I wanted to start with it because so much has been at stake with respect to the aftermath of the Macondo event. We know that in the weeks before that event, the Obama administration was finally turning toward energy. There had been some hope, given bipartisan support for some resolutions, at least, with respect to carbon legislation and with respect to the Copenhagen meeting, that something might happen. The first gesture that the president had made as he was warming up for his new energy initiative was a remarkable opening of acreage offshore to exploitation by companies as a sort of pre-giveaway to building the bipartisan consensus that he was trying to build. And he had in mind, as we all know, a vision of American power American influence in a world of the 21st century that required remarkable change and innovation with respect to the energy sector, with respect to the innovativeness of the American economy. He may have, in that process, thought, in thinking 50 years ahead, gotten himself in trouble in two respects. One is those of us who have been in the policy business in the past, and my little experience of that was something Amy did not mention, namely the establishment of the SFC, the Synthetic Fuels Corporation, at the end of the Carter administration. And we know that thinking forward is always a dangerous minefield because you don't know what processes will unfold in getting from here to there. The other was, of course, the remarkable inability of the president or the administration or the people around him to think about how you get from here to there, how to think about bridges. And there's no doubt that in any bridge to a less carbon-intensive future is a more hydrocarbon-intensive economy with cleaner fuels than we have been relying on before. And as I hope I will put in context, the Macondo event has been, in many respects, a major setback to the United States, to global energy. It also, as Amy has herself indicated in her own writings, and I assume in remarks she made yesterday, that there are many times in which business as usual may be the best path, and we may well be in one of those situations now. I think if we were to describe U.S. energy policy, it really is based on inertia on the one hand, and what regulators might be doing on the other hand. We've given up policy from a policy perspective, partly because of gridlock, partly because of confusion in the administration, partly because the U.S. government has always been a divided one when it comes to energy policy, with no coherent policy, starting with no coherence in the structure of policymaking. So inertia has always ruled. It will rule now. It will be very important. But regulatory changes that have been discussed in the papers for this conference are clearly also going to be important. And as we look at business as usual, I think the shale revolution has to be something that we need to think about. And we need to think about it because it really is, and Amy has in fact written on this subject a lot, it has been a major consequence not only in the United States, but also abroad. I noticed in reading news this morning that the Qataris and Exxon have announced the first LNG cargo to come from their newest project will be moving into the U.S. Gulf in about 3 weeks' time. And that's sort of a funny thing to have happen for reasons that we all know, as unconventional natural gas has been transforming the United States into a relatively permanent surplus natural gas producing country. And this first initial cargo from 2 super trains that are coming into the market this year, a market that's already glutted with gas, comes just weeks after the first license for an export terminal from the United States, from the non-Alaskan part of the United States, has been approved. And I think it's fair to say that the ripple effects of this at home and abroad, and I will talk about the abroad in a bit, are still unfolding and still have some surprises ahead of us. Certainly, it's the case that the production profile of natural gas in the United States has changed. And this is a picture of proven reserves, SEC defined, which is clearly understated, since we know that the U.S. has gone from an SEC defined 8 years of RP, or reserve to production ratio, to what looks like it's going to be 120 years of reserve to production ratio. And that's an awful big challenge, not only to the U.S. market and the global market, but to conceptual thinking about the hydrocarbon business. Speaking about the Hubbard's curve, I have here a picture taken from an article that put out this summer from the Oil and Gas Journal. This is the median term projection of U.S. natural gas production based on modest regulatory controls, based on a price high enough that it may slow down the development of shale resources. But as you can see, this projects, you can see where the first peak was 30 years ago, and this projects a 40 to 60% increase in U.S. natural gas production. That's an astonishing amount. And if the U.S. adds more LNG export capacity, it will provide even more pressure internationally, and we can talk about that a bit if there's time in discussion. I note that there are 2 multi-cargo contracts of LNG heading to India that were signed this summer, and the first cargoes have been sent already, and they are both benchmarked off of Henry Hub pricing. That may seem a little odd. It's not odd in the sense that if you need a benchmark, you go to the most liquid benchmark in the market. The most liquid benchmark in the market happens to be Henry Hub. It might not have anything to do with domestic markets at the moment in the Far East or in South Asia, but it is liquid and it does work, and as long as you have the right transportation differential put in place, you can even hedge that set of cargoes. Gas is really ready to challenge coal, and this is where the regulatory environment is giving gas a significant amount of a push. And I think what really has happened with gas is that the main argument of the coal interests, whether they are in coal-producing states or in coal-consuming areas and utilities, the main arguments about gas are just now wrong. And they're wrong as a result of logistical changes in the U.S. and as a result of the U.S. being in a surplus gas environment. We have fewer and fewer bottlenecks to delivery, which means fewer and fewer causes for volatility in the system. The logistics system is changing very rapidly. As you can see with the figures on the right, Canada, Western Canada, no longer exports gas to Eastern Canada. Canada in the West exports gas to the mid-continent of the U.S., the east of the U.S. The U.S. exports gas and oil to the eastern part of Canada. The North American grid is a continental grid. And part of that surge in exports to Canada is related to the end of stranded gas in Wyoming and Colorado through the Rex pipeline system. And part of it comes from other things that are having an astonishing impact. This is the growth of new pipelines for natural gas in the United States. There are a couple of things to note about this surge in pipeline capacity. One of them, and the most important to me, is that there are no take-or-pay contracts that have been behind this extraordinary build-out of pipelines, gathering systems, long-haul and short-haul. And the arguments made abroad, whether by Gazprom or by others, about the need for long-term take-or-pay contracts based on oil-linked mechanisms is really just rubbish, as can be seen in what's happening in the U.S. market. Here is really the killer. Look at the 2 factors that happen to the financial curves for natural gas. Not only the lowering of the curves, but more importantly, the extraordinary reduction in volatility that has come about through the surplus capacity we have to produce, the permanent surplus capacity to produce, and we now are at a period of time when there are no distinctions between the January, February, and July, August prices for natural gas. It's a kind of remarkable period of time, and this is absolutely going to help challenge King Coal in terms of the marketplace. Price is also challenging. These are the CAP and Henry Hub forward prices, and gas is just more competitive than coal out the curve for the first time in a very, very, very long time. Electric power is clearly the demand key for natural gas in the United States. That's largely because if we look at other sectors, the residential sector, the industrial sector, the NGV sector, or what might happen through a carbon bill, The real source of natural gas demand growth is going to be coal plant retirements that are clearly going to be accelerated by new EPA rules. It's not legislation on carbon, but it's EPA rules. It's the Clean Air Interstate Rule being replaced by the Clear Air Transport Rule and by the Clean Air Mercury Rule and the elimination of hazardous air pollutants that is going to have a remarkable acceleration in natural demand growth in the U.S. We're going to see coal plants retiring, in part because of the costs that will be required to enable them to meet the new Mercury and HAP standards. We know that there's a voluntary 20 gigawatts of coal retirements between now and 2020 on the horizon. That's already been announced on a voluntary basis by utilities owning those plants, that these plants are more than 50, 60, or in some cases 70 years old. But it's our judgment that 20 gigawatts will be at least double to 40. Our natural gas and utility equity analysts just issued a report last week in which they argue quite convincingly that it probably is going to be closer to 50 gigawatts of plants that will be retired, and natural gas is going to be the major beneficiary of that. The rate of growth is going to be probably around a little between a half and a million and a BCF of gas a day. It may be closer to 1 BCF a day as we get closer to 2020. That's not going to be enough to bring the gas price up a lot, but it's certainly going to be a significant amount. Meanwhile, the U.S. gas surplus is having global impacts. We had a gas conference that, as Credit Suisse did in Europe last Friday. I gave a presentation in which I argued that 2011 or 2012 may be what was in the oil markets 1985, that we have seen Gazprom not increase volume into Western Europe at all last year. We see new storage facilities, new regasification facilities throughout Europe, and the only reasons that gas demand increased in Europe last year were, on the one hand, the second 30-year cold winter in a row, with the expectation that this is going to be a significantly milder winter, and the other was the spurt of industrial gas demand in Germany that was clearly not a result of Germany coming out of recession, but rather a result of favorable exchange rate relationships that led to a surge in manufacturing for export with a cheap euro last spring. And now that the euro has regained ground against the dollar and is likely to continue to hold that ground, industrial gas demand is also going to fall. And the preference is for gas-on-gas pricing, when gas-on-gas pricing is somewhere between 50 and 55% of Russian oil-linked gas. The only way that the Russian gas community, which is a highly fractured, highly internally disputed community, the only way they might see to enhance revenues is by buying back market share. And this could be similar to what the Saudis did in 1985-86 when they lost market share. The only way to buy it back is through the pricing mechanism. There's also, of course, a bunch of obstacles. The tight politics between leaders, current and ex-leaders of European governments with the Russian government has certainly been prolonging the oil-linked contracts in the East. There have been a lot of remarkable articles about the corrupt politics of politicians in European countries, France, Germany, Italy, the big ones, and Russian government entities or officials with respect to gas. That is going to be an obstacle, but the market is certainly going to win out. More controversial is what's happening in Asia. Jim Jensen, who I respect as one of the best analysts of the emerging global gas market, changed his mind in a paper he gave at the Aspen Institute this past summer, in which he argued that he was wrong about the pace of change of natural gas pricing, and he argued that Asia will remain the base load for oil-linked contracts, crude oil-linked contracts. I tried to follow his argument, and I think he's just dead wrong. It's certainly the case that if we look at Japan and the original LNG contracts and look at how they were followed in Korea and Taiwan, these are countries that had no alternative source of energy, no natural gas, no coal, no oil. And they found themselves, as Japan did, burning oil directly in power plants, and in order to diversify sources of supply and increase energy security, the original LNG contracts were crude oil linked at the import terminals, the JCC formula coming out of Japan, mimicked by Korean buyers and Taiwan buyers. But China and India are quite different. They are relatively well endowed with energy. They have indigenous gas production. They have a preference not to have oil-linked contracts. I talked about the 2 Indian contracts this summer. Spot gas is the ruler in the Far East at the moment. Taiwan's imports this summer were 53% spot gas at 55% of oil-linked contracts. But the big changes are coming in my mind because the natural markets for gas, as they're developing in China and India, have burner-tip gas-on-gas competitive pricing. And why would one at the increment have an oil-linked contract when you have emerging domestic gas markets? I would note that China has not implemented 2 MOUs with Qatar. China has not implemented or put in place pricing with any agreement with Russia on natural gas, and that's because of major disputes on how the material ought to be priced. The Chinese have one big pipeline from Central Asia of what was stranded gas from Central Asia. They have contract relations with producers in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and now Uzbekistan. They are all based on a price somewhere between Henry Hub and an oil-linked price. And they have openers in them that are likely to bring the price down. So that's what it is on the buy side. On the sell side, Australia is emerging as the challenger. It's sort of the Russia of the old days in the Far East, pricing just underneath what the market is in order to buy market share. They're price takers. It's not Qatar Inc. in Australia. It's Chevron and Woodside and Santos and Total and Hess and CNPC and Shell who set the price. They are people or companies used to market pricing. They want the highest price, but it almost certainly is not going to be a crude oil linked price. It almost certainly will have some kind of ceiling on it, unlike what the traditional suppliers want. Less dramatic so far, but equally important is shale oil. I spent my vacation this summer in Wyoming. I decided to reread a book by John McPhee on the geology of Wyoming. John McPhee is a wonderful New Yorker writer with ties to the Princeton geologists. He lives there. He wrote a bestseller on Bill Bradley, but he writes mostly popular books about plate tectonics. And I was struck by this book on Wyoming, which had in it a series of interviews with a well-known Wyoming-based geologist who was the U.S. Geological Survey's main guy in place there. And in the late 70s and 80s, when the shale resources of Wyoming were mapped out, Wyoming alone, not including Utah or Montana or Colorado, was estimated to have 1.6 trillion barrels of oil, shale oil in place, 600 billion worth, according to the geologist, were probably going to be capable of commercial production sometime in the next 50 years. And that's actually what we're seeing. We're seeing a remarkable increase in U.S. oil production in the lower 48. Lower 48 production, if the EIA data are to be believed, and they're not broken out in the last quarter by pad district, but they seem to be up about 250,000 barrels a day in the last 4 months of reporting. The producers in the Bakken seem to have twice the production coming on stream as the U.S. Department of Energy is estimating. And it looks as though the Williston Basin, the Eagle Ford, and whatever is in California could be adding significantly to production. We, in our own company analysis, have 1 million barrels a day coming out of shale oil or shale-related oil by 2017, and that's a very conservative estimate. It could grow more than that, excluding the Eagle Ford. And of course, last week, El Paso spent $180 million for acreage in the Permian Basin, which gave a significant boost to the revenue of the University of Texas and Texas A&M. So in little bits and pieces, onshore U.S. production is increasing, probably even more than Russian production. I happen to believe that non-OPEC production will continue to rise at a rate close to 1 million barrels a day if you add together the lower 48, even including the drop in offshore production, Colombia, what's happening in Oman, China, and other places in the world. What else is happening from a regulatory perspective? There's a lot about happiness at this conference and gasoline prices, and I look forward to that conversation in a few minutes' time. But there's no doubt that the combination of CAFE standards on the one hand and the renewable fuel standards on the other hand are at the same time that we're seeing a resurgence, other than the offshore, of U.S. production of oil. We're seeing a dramatic decline in the appetite for gasoline. This is having an enormous impact in places that we tend not to think about. Certainly gasoline has become a waste product. This is remarkable now that even if we look forward to next year's gasoline season, the financial markets are pricing RBOB at under heating oil. There's no point on the forward curve where RBOB is trading at a higher price than heating oil. Gasoline has become, not just in the U.S., but globally, a waste product. We're producing more of it than we want. We're storing more of it than we want. And it's having this remarkable transformation effect internationally. The U.S., starting in 2007, became yet again a net exporter of finished motor gasoline. And we continue to see that rising. It will continue to rise in the years going forward. Part of this has been the way that PADD 3 refiners, some of them have become merchants and have exploited opportunities given to them by the collapse of the Venezuelan refining system. Part of it are just sheer global oil supply-demand balances. PADD 3 and PADD 2 refiners are in relatively good shape. The PADD 3 refiners, because of this market share they can buy in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere. The PADD 2 refiners, because of their wonderful logistical location. PADD 1 and PADD 5 refiners are in a very difficult marketplace. PADD 5 refiners will increasingly be suffering from something else that's happening internationally, namely the transformation of China and India into net exporters of diesel and gasoline, done under government subsidies, done through unfair competition, done in ways that, because the oil industry has such a bad repute in Washington, is not leading to any retaliatory trade measures, which certainly should be put in place if you think just conceptually about a Chinese government that has decided to have a 20% surplus refining capacity for national security reasons, importing, sucking in crude oil, and exporting product. And to give you a sense of the transformation, in July 2008, at China's peak as a product importer, China had net imports of distillate and gasoline of close to 800,000 barrels a day. This past July, they had net exports of close to 500,000 barrels a day. That is a pretty remarkable transformation between 2008 and 2010. And the Chinese companies are building about 1 million barrels a day of new refining capacity year after year. It's on the onshore that the Macondo makes a huge difference. U.S. deepwater production had risen to 1.65 million barrels a day last spring, 35% of global deepwater production. We saw the U.S. offshore rising to 3 million barrels a day by 2017, still keeping 35% of global deepwater. I think one of the main challenges to the views of peak oil people has been in the deep water of the world where there are no acreage constraints. The only constraint has been rigs available. The rigs available were negligible. There was only one available in 1990, 17 in 2000. There are 154 rigs working in deep water globally now. The result has been an escalation of deepwater discoveries and production. I note that not the EIA, not the IEA, not the OPEC Secretariat in their analysis of non-OPEC production next year mentions Ghana, mentions other Africa. There's a major deepwater Ghanaian field coming on stream in December. It will not be an insignificant field next year or the year after. The MMS, of course, was a disaster in waiting. And anyone who had given 2 minutes of thought to the MMS knew that reform was required. In September 2008, the very heart of the 2008 presidential election campaign, the MMS scandal arose. The MMS scandal is really deeper than just the illicit sex, drugs, and financial flows that went from oil companies and gas companies to government officials. It has to do with the very concept of what the Department of Interior was doing. So during the last administration, the U.S. created a national oil company. And the national oil company took the royalty in kind and sold it in the marketplace as a competitor to other companies selling it in the marketplace. When the Department of Interior proudly announced its creation of a little oil company, it proudly announced that it was putting in place $100 million worth of risk management financial systems. To put that in context, I have worked in 3 financial institutions that have really state-of-the-art financial mechanisms for managing VAR, managing risk exposure. The 3 places that I've been, the most expensive system put in place was 1/5 of the cost of the system put in place by the Department of Interior. It's not just that this was something that probably should never have been done, but it's also the case that from the perspective of managing the deep water, managing federal lands, the U.S. was a third world country not only with respect to the corruption that was exposed in the investigations of 2008, but a third world country in terms of the management of the whole system, having in one agency with a $29 million budget, the licensing of deep water, the regulation of deep water, and the revenue collection from deep water, something that no other country involved in the deep water has. Not Norway, not the UK, not Canada, not Australia, not Brazil, not the countries of West Africa. The US was in the midst not only of an ethical failure, but an organizational failure. And it should have been high on the agenda of any administration to have done something about that. Why the reporting community has not yet looked at the whole system is something that I find puzzling. But there too we find the deep water in the hands of the regulators, regulators who may end the moratorium sometime soon. But if we look at the whole domestic energy system, it's in the hands of inertia and gridlock and the regulatory system. And we know that as regulators act, whatever EPA does is going to be the subject of lawsuits reflecting the divisions in our society among those who want to protect the environment, those who want to exploit the environment, both having national security interests at stake, some having a 50-year interest at stake, some having a 1-year interest at stake. And there are critical dates ahead of us on a whole bunch of things. And in the meantime, it's also the case that the U.S. has abandoned any international strategy except for sanctions on Iran, has abandoned thinking about co-opting China and Russia as they pose major challenges to the rules of the game. It's not all that bleak. It has in it the positive impact that inertia will work. We've seen the revolution that's taken place in shale gas. I think we are seeing unfolding something pretty remarkable in oil, and it may be that business as usual may be a very good way of protecting at least some of U.S. national interests. With that, I think I have 3 minutes for interaction, depending on what you want to do, Amy, and I'm happy to respond to discussion, attacks, or questions.
Hi. I hope you're right about the coal retirements. We've been talking about that in the United States for quite some time, and I guess my question to you is, why is this time different? The EPA has the ruling, they're under court mandate, but it strikes me that it could be the same situation where we're just waiting.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that make it a little different. The utility sector is not exactly in the best financial shape. It has overcapacities. I suspect that, as has been the case in other parts of the energy chain, we will be seeing a significant consolidation of the industry. And with that consolidation, I think there's going to be an acceleration of these easy target retirements. Certainly, the nuclear option is not an option for replacing these retirements, and the fact that there has been these changes in two ways with respect to natural gas. One is the price competition against coal, and even if Jim Mulva is right in what his remarks were yesterday about where the natural settlement price might be, and I actually think he was a little bit on the high side, but it's competitive, and it just doesn't have the volatility. And I can tell you that from my own personal perspective, I spend more time with the bank that I work for as utility clients than I do with almost any other sector, and this is the issue that is up there, number one, number two issue in senior management and directors of companies. I think it is different.
So in terms of your shale gas being more than sufficient, I mean, some of our work has suggested that if policy were actually to push gas even more heavily, like having CNG in vehicles and some of these other policies, that you could actually end up running up against the gas supply possibilities from shale gas, and that could involve the US actually getting back into imports down the track. So this is going, if you went beyond business as usual to really push gas, you could have a slightly different picture to the one you're talking about.
Clearly, there's always a debate when you think about the future, and this is a discussable issue. I think the resource base has been well enough defined, and the timetable for accelerating NGVs is well enough known that there might be some positive impact on prices that will bring the supply chain into the fold. So it's always difficult to think about something that's certain in an uncertain world, but I tend to believe that when you have the resource base growing at the rate that it's been growing in the places that it's been growing and have a surplus, surplus will have to be used for something. I was very surprised when Cheniere got the go-ahead on a liquefaction plant for export. I was surprised at how benign the policy response or the regulatory response was, and I think that there will be some limits over time if the LNG export business gets going in the U.S. which should make that safety valve coming from the LNG side a little bit more difficult to break or open up. Come on, ask something hard, challenging. Say I'm totally wrong.
Well, how can I say that, Ed? As always, very...
Because you know me well enough. You can
very, very interesting. But maybe this is hard because you said it's difficult to think about the future. And certainly, let's think about it from the point of view of a mid-sized gas producer, domestic gas producer, shale gas producer in this country. If you were in their position of trying to plan ahead for the next 5-10 years, given the scenario that you've talked about, what sort of advice would you give them? What would you do if you were in their position, or what advice would you give them? Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's hard to generalize because where you stand depends on where you sit. If you happen to be lucky enough to be in a liquids-rich environment like the Eagle Ford, you can have a negative netback on natural gas and make money, and it still makes sense to go forward. If you are in another area, if you're in New York State, it's just kind of impossible from a regulatory perspective. So I think it depends on where you are. Some are more fortunate than others in terms of the cost base. It's remarkable the degree to which the productivity per well drilled has gone up. It's remarkable the degree to which costs in general have come down. It's remarkable the degree to which people analyzing this business make mistakes between putting full cycle costs on half cycle economics. Acreage acquisition is clearly a higher cost. Initial fracking is initially a higher cost. But as the business has grown, we've seen half cycle economics replacing full cycle economics. And then again, depending on where you are, there's no doubt that we have too many producers. Too many producers have given rise to this phenomenon. The fact that the forward curves have helped in financing this up until this year, that virtually zero interest rates have enabled companies to borrow against future production will become alleviated. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to see consolidation. We're going to see best field practices as they had been imposed in the oil sector, imposed in the gas sector. As companies like your former company, majors, super majors, get into the business, they're likely to be a little bit less wanton in producing than some smaller companies. But it's like the utility sector, a sector that is bound to see significant consolidation sooner rather than later.
Two questions. You mentioned Jim Jensen. Jim Jensen and I sat in this very same room with Stanford's Energy Modeling Forum about 5 or 6 years ago, and Peter Hartley had done this interesting model that showed that we thought that over time the gas market, maybe with a slightly longer lag, was going to look like the oil market, that LNG receiving terminals were not going to be the basis for which we won't have global gas-on-gas pricing and gas-on-gas arbitrage. So my first question is, do you think we're there? How long do you think it'll take before we get to that world, or do you still see some structural barrier to that world? So that's my gas question. On my oil question, I was very struck by your description of the oil royalty trading system of the MMS. And if you think about the scandal that's possible with an administration that refused to use the SPR, saying that it's only needed for emergencies, and then you have the government profiting on reselling oil at a higher and higher price. I'd just like you to comment on what you think the government should be doing now moving forward in organizing our national system in such a way that we're not a national oil company with corruption.
Thanks, Amy. I think the gas market will not, in the lifetime of anyone in this room, be anything like the oil market. Gas is a local phenomena in terms of local markets, and there's no reason to assume that the price of gas competing with coal and other fuels in Atlanta, Georgia, ought to be the same price elsewhere. I think there are two really big bottlenecks on the gas side that are related to the logistics system. The traditional market in the East and in the Mediterranean is kind of a Bolshevik model, tied to the Russian Bolshevik model. It's very hard to induce gas competitive pricing in Greece. It's very hard to induce it in a lot of places that don't have access to a grid. The European problem has been that you couldn't move gas from Germany freely to Italy to work at an arbitrage there, and you need pipelines and international agreements to have this work out. On the LNG side, there are significant destination clause requirements that have to be dropped, and there are significant molecule differences between gas coming into Cove Point as opposed to Isle of Grain that make that also a difference. So I perceive a market in which it would be nice to have other hubs, TFF, probably a German hub, but there's no reason, as I indicated in my remarks, why Henry Hub can't serve as a global benchmark. So I think there is that common feature. The Chinese are very big on having markets. They may well want to have a gas-traded market. They're a big country. They'll have pipeline gas, indigenous gas, coal bed methane gas, shale gas, imported gas by pipeline and by LNG, and they'll have a market that could emerge. So it could be another benchmark. On your second question, I'm not going to answer all of it. I have for a long time, as you well know, had the very deeply felt view that the main failure of the SPR is it doesn't work logistically. The port congestion is such and the pipeline congestion is such that the theoretical release doesn't work because the logistics system doesn't work. And I had urged the president before he was elected during the campaign to challenge the Bush administration to test the SPR. I thought it could have a bunch of interesting impacts, but one of them is to see where the system isn't workable. It's kind of workable when you have an outage in Memphis and you can get oil onto a pipeline to Memphis, but it's not workable in any large-scale emergency that I can conceive of. This might mean restructuring where the oil is. It might even mean replacing some of that oil with oil in caverns that are more close to waterborne areas, like the salt caverns of Newfoundland in a foreign country. So I think there is some conceptual work that could be done. I appreciate the work you've done on product storage. I think it's a lot easier to put federal mandates into minimal storage holdings by companies than it is for the federal government to have a New England heating oil reserve, but that's a separate issue. I think the logistics system is the core to it. I think the concept of the SPR makes a lot of sense. The U.S. on the SPR has been criticized in the past, and this is sort of off the chart discussion. We know that in the run-up to the price run-up in 2008, people thought Phil Verlager was nuts when he said the U.S. should stop putting WTI-like crudes into the SPR. He was dead on right, and that was because the time in that price run-up, the world had, by regulation, imposed product specifications on users of transport fuels. Diesel and gasoline that could not be met by the global refining system, that put a significant premium on light sweet crude. The differential between light sweet, heavy sour crudes blew out as margins went up. The U.S. purchasing of crude oil was clearly one of the major factors in the run-up in prices in 2008. In today's market, I think there are two things that are putting a floor under prices that are challenges to public policy. One is the free put that Saudi Arabia gives the market by telling the market it will protect a particular price, which is probably higher than incremental cost economics, which is one of the reasons we're having non-OPEC production growing. The other than the free Saudi put is Chinese discretionary buying. The largest incremental voluntary buyer of oil in the world is China writ large. Chinese strategic stockpile first phase of 130 million barrels was suspended in May 2008 when prices were hitting 100. 30 million of the 100 million were put in place. Prices crashed, and the Chinese system had 100 million barrels of capacity that could be filled, and between November and May 2008-9, 100 million barrels of oil was bought by China at a rate of 400,000 or 500,000 barrels a day. It's a huge discretionary rate. The Chinese currently have 130 million free storage capacity in the second phase of their strategic petroleum reserve. I suspect if oil prices go down, we'll see a very rapid increase in that, and that's also a challenge globally to free markets. Anyway, I hope I've satisfied you a bit, and now we really run over in time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, our next presentation is, for those of you who've been in our study group, the long-awaited natural gas readout of our modeling. That presentation is going to be done by Ken Metlock. He is our James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics here at the Institute. He teaches our Energy Economics course, and many of you have his former students in your divisions. And Ken is a prize-winning economist, holds the joint IAEE Award for the best paper of the year for Energy Journal, and worked on a whole range of projects. 2 summers ago, worked with the AAPG to do a new shale resource assessment. And he worked on the original 2003 National Petroleum Council study on North American natural gas. So we are pleased and honored to have him as a lead in our group, and we look forward to hearing his discussion today of our natural gas findings.
Okay, so welcome back to those of you who were here yesterday, and welcome for the first time to those of you who weren't. We've sort of broken the presentation of the core study findings up into several phases. Amy gave an overview yesterday, which sort of touched on a lot of the high points, and then I talked really a little bit more in detail about the modeling exercise that was done and focused on what we see in the renewable space. And so today, as promised, I'm going to talk about natural gas. When we embarked on this study, that was really the initial goal, to understand what carbon abatement mechanisms and renewable portfolio standards and electric vehicle policies, or alternative vehicle policies more generally, would mean for the natural gas market. So we had to tackle the energy market first, which was no small task, and then zero in on natural gas. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is joint work with my colleague Peter Hartley. We're sort of partners in crime on this. We've been working with the Rice World Gas Trade Model now for, I guess it's 6 years. And many of you are already familiar with it. So I'm going to really gloss over all the details of the model because those are available through other sources, and get to the heart of the matter. So, well, there we go. So this is a repeat of the very first slide I showed yesterday, and this is just to get you grounded again. We really were interested in trying to understand, as I said a minute ago, what the impact of all these different policies that are on the table, what those impacts are for energy and natural gas markets more specifically. And in doing so, we have been working on this for 3 years. We decided to take a scenario approach so we could isolate individual aspects of different policies and understand exactly what those mean. So again, today the focus is on natural gas. And so to do that, I have to talk a little bit, and I'll sort of gloss through a couple of the first slides, but a little bit about the shale revolution that Ed just touched on, and I thought he did a very good job of discussing it. But what I want to try to highlight are some of the assumptions that we actually use in our modeling so that you can understand some of the uncertainties that drive some of the outcomes. This is just basic information about the difference between conventional and unconventional. I think for this audience, you're probably well enough versed to slide through that. One of the things that's actually very interesting about shale that I think is worth mentioning here that I think is different in a lot of ways from traditional gas production is that you can, in effect, in terms of timing your development process, so timing your completions, timing when you actually do your fractures, you can almost mimic a just-in-time production process. So, in effect, once you have a shale resource tapped, in a lot of ways, it becomes a virtual source of storage. So it's very different to sort of get your head around that when you're used to looking at traditional, natural gas developments. When you think about what that means, not only for long-term pricing, but for short-term pricing. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the current pace of development in shale is sustainable over the long term, so on and so forth. And a lot of that's tied to cost, but when you start digging into the data, a lot of the concerns arise from, I think, misinterpretation of data that's really driven by the fact that the shale development process is very different than, say, development of a conventional reservoir or even a tight gas reservoir. Again, I think we had the same issue that we have yesterday, so I'll just mention this. The slides will be available online, so if you can't read some of the figures, I apologize for that. I'll try to highlight the high points and sort of move on, okay? But shale has really resulted in a paradigm shift. Ed touched on that in his presentation. As recently as 10 years ago, we were really talking about massive levels of imports, increasing imports in the United States to meet our natural gas demand, to meet growing natural gas demand. And of course, there was a lot of emphasis on pushing natural gas because it's a clean burning fuel. If we go back into the 90s, it was a relatively inexpensive fuel, especially when you combine with that particular fact with the fact that you have very high efficiency potential in the electricity generation sector, a la natural gas combined cycles. You can get close to 60% efficiency with those types of facilities. So it looked like a very promising fuel. And to fuel that demand, we really were thinking about bringing on lots and lots of LNG import capacity, and there was this rush to develop import terminals. There was as many as 47 terminals that had certificates to move forward. Nobody, I think, really believed we'd see 47 terminals constructed, but the point is there was this rush to get there. There have been several expansions. A couple of terminals were actually recommissioned. Others were actually greenfield expansions. There have been expansions or brownfield expansions, so at existing sites. All in all, by 2012, we stand to be close to 20 billion cubic feet a day. That's just over a third of current consumption. So you're talking about a massive import capability, quite frankly, in a country that doesn't need it at this point. Why don't we need it? Well, because one of the pushes to really develop LNG import capacity was the signal that the market was sending. Prices were becoming higher. They were becoming a little bit more volatile because we were starting to bump into domestic capacity constraints. What that also did is it signaled developers domestically to start to push the frontier, look to new resources. Now, it's always interesting to talk about this as an economist or as an energy analyst more generally and say new resources, right? But one of the things I learned when I dove into the AAPG literature a couple of years ago when I was participating in that assessment that Amy mentioned, it was like getting slapped in the face. These guys have known about this stuff for 40 years. This isn't new to them, right? It really was just a technology play. And so in a lot of ways, what high prices in the early part of the 2000s did is they created an incentive to push that boundary, and some new innovations with regard to being able to tap that resource were really developed and pushed, initially in the Barnett Shale, but then a lot of those lessons were extrapolated into other shale basins around North America. On the LNG front, we've seen a similar story in Europe, and actually that's helped facilitate some of the push towards gas-on-gas competition that Ed was touching on earlier as well. So this is always a fun slide to show when I'm talking about natural gas markets. I hope it's visible to you guys. What it is a composite of satellite photographs on clear nights around the world. You can see the continents. You can see the little white dots. That's where all the lights are on. Is this visible to you out there? Okay, I want to make sure. The importance of little white dots where the lights are on, those are demand sinks. This is where we consume energy. So you see Western Europe, the eastern half of the United States, all of Japan, South Korea. I always like to point out South Korea because it highlights the role of geopolitics really in access to energy. In case you don't know your geography, there's South Korea. It's not an island, but it certainly looks like one on the map. So it's sort of an interesting point to make. But the other thing that's important to notice on this picture are the big blobs of color that are all over the place. They range from a bright red all the way down to a deep purple or a blue that kind of disappears into the background. These are areas where natural gas is found. Natural gas resource, not reserves, resource. What you notice, or what should jump out on the map at you, is the fact that all the biggest, brightest red spots, right, and the brighter the color, the more intensely endowed the region is with resource, they're nowhere near where the lights are on. So you have to figure out how to connect the big, bright red spots to all the little white dots, right? And hence, geopolitics gets intermingled in international natural gas trade, so on and so forth. Now, the thing that's really interesting about the shale revolution, that's sort of been a game changer, aside from all the impacts on the market, sort of in a commercial sense, is geopolitically it could have really large repercussions. Namely because if you look at where shale is located, it's pretty much located right in the heart of where all the little white dots are. So what that does, if you can actually access that in a commercially feasible way, is that it abates the need to move the stuff from where the big bright red blobs are, right, to the white dots. So if you think about the United States, all right, we were talking about importing natural gas all along the eastern seaboard, Gulf Coast, and even the West Coast. Well, notice where the shale exists. All right, this has basically turned thinking on its head in a matter of a decade. If you look at Europe, one has to wonder, and if you look at Asia, one has to wonder. We're talking about increasing imports into those regions primarily because, especially in Asia, you're looking at very rapid rates of demand growth, right? And there's a thirst for gas. But if you can start to access these resources in a more commercially feasible way, what does that do to the import picture? What does that do to expectations? Right? Could have a very similar impact to what we've seen in North America. This is just another table that describes the global shale resource. This was sort of conventional wisdom a little over a decade ago. It's data that's actually used quite a bit still, largely because internationally updating this assessment has been slow going. A lot of times these assessments are updated largely because there's a commercial desire for the assessment to be updated. And so there are actually commissions that have been formed in Europe, for example, to look at the shale resource in Europe, and some of these numbers are slowly being altered. But what you can see is you actually have a very massive number. Now, what you see in the table is a resource in place number. So this is not what we can actually access. This is just what is believed to be bound up in the shale formations. What we can access is a different issue. It's important to understand that because when we actually model this, we don't actually model the resource in place number. We model what's technically recoverable. So what can we get to using today's technology regardless of cost? And then over that, you have to embed a cost curve, right? So you allow the model to tell you what's economically recoverable over time against that technically recoverable base. The technically recoverable base, just so you can get a quick idea of this, that resource in place number is always very, very large. What's technically recoverable is a subset of that, economically recoverable, a subset of that. And then what people talk about with regard to proved reserves is even yet a subset of that. It's always fun to point this out to my energy economics students because a lot of times I will find them making mistakes such as, proved reserves indicate we have 11 years of production left. Well, that's been true, for example, in the United States for about 50 years in the oil space. So it's not a really good indicator of what's left. You really have to focus in on the resource endowment itself. And that's actually what we do in our modeling. Now, costs are important. This is just a figure to indicate that, or to highlight the point that costs actually do cycle. right? It's never okay to just say current costs are X, therefore they will be X forever, right? In fact, what this picture actually shows, just very briefly, is that the costs tend to move with the real price of oil. And these are two different metrics to indicate what the cost of developing a field are. What this should highlight to you is that if you're looking forward and you assume that the cost of developing a particular well is going to be similar to what it was in 2008, you're probably overestimating costs. Unless, of course, you believe the price of oil is going to rise into that level and stay there forever. The point is you have to be conscious or cognizant of the fact that these things do cycle, particularly when you're looking out through time. Now, what do we use for North American shale? Since this is a very important resource with regard to the modeling itself that we undertook. It's important, as I highlighted yesterday, because when you think about gas as a low carbon intensity fuel relative to, say, coal especially, the more and more gas you have, or the flatter and longer the supply curve for that low carbon intensity fuel is, the more and more substitution opportunities you have at a lower cost of carbon. So it's a very important thing to try to sort of grapple with when you're modeling sort of broadly what's going to happen to the energy mix over time, particularly when you have a CO2 type policy. But what you see here is a table that indicates a resource assessment in, this is a technically recoverable resource assessment in TCF. No, it's probably difficult for you to read, but to sum it up, basically we have close to 600 trillion cubic feet representing the shale resource in North America. By some accounts, this is low. There was a recent assessment that was done by Advanced Resources International that indicates close to 1,000 trillion cubic feet. So that's, dramatically different, but that assessment was just released this year, and there's still ongoing work. And that's actually one of the key points of all this. When you look at the assessments and how they've evolved just over the past 5 or 6 years, they've gone from what was sort of the conventionally accepted number for shale that the EIA was using in its modeling efforts back in 2005 of about 140 trillion cubic feet to, like I said a minute ago, in 2010, you have an assessment that's released that's about 1,000 trillion cubic feet, so an order of magnitude difference roughly. We're still learning about this resource, and that's really the point that I want to highlight from this graphic. Within the model, we actually, as I said a minute ago, we take the technical recoverable endowment and we try to actually fit cost curves. So what is the cost of developing that resource? You have to put North America in context. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to highlight a point that actually Peter made when he asked Ed a question. In particular, down the road, if you start to accelerate natural gas demand, we actually do see that you'll start to need more and more imports. But what you see here is the blue line is North American resource endowment. It's quite large. If you include all the unconventional and conventional, you're closing in on 2,000 trillion cubic feet. Right? Now, the costs obviously escalate as you try to really push that envelope. But if you look at the former Soviet Union and the Middle East, you're talking about 1.5 and 2 times greater, respectively, in terms of the total resource endowment. So the endowments matter. They're absolutely massive when you get into those parts of the world. So what you're talking about when you talk about shale and the resource potential that it provides North America is extremely important. But if you want to understand how certain policies are going to impact the import environment in the United States, you have to understand that FSU and Middle East resources are very high and they're typically very low cost. Okay, so in a world where you push the envelope in North America, you will eventually run into a situation where imports will be the commercially desired outcome because it's going to be the lowest cost resource. So some results. Just to put you into, put all this into context, this is what falls out of the model from 2010 through 2040 with regard to the price at Henry Hub. Everything I'm going to show you with regard to prices are in real dollars or in 2005 inflation-adjusted dollars. You see here that it's pretty stable. There's not a lot of action, and that is largely due to the fact that there's a very large resource endowment domestically that can be developed at a pretty constant cost. Let's just point this out here, right? This dollar per MCF, by the way, is not the break-even price. It's actually the development cost. You actually have to earn a return on that, which is why the break-even costs are a little bit higher. But you can see that there's not a lot of upward slope in that curve, which is why there's not a lot of upward slope in this curve. Okay, so price environment going forward is predicted to be pretty stable by the model. What happens on the shale front? Well, it grows dramatically. So there's nothing really that should be all that shocking here. In fact, we're seeing something that approaches on the order of 14 trillion cubic feet of production. This is by basin. By far, the two largest basins long-term are predicted to be the Marcellus and the Haynesville. That also should not be surprising for those of you who have been following developments in shale. Perhaps one of the biggest uncertainties, I think, on the Marcellus front in particular is how regulatory action might interfere with development and the development pace there. But we have made allowance in the modeling for the moratorium in New York, so on and so forth. So, what does that mean for the share of domestic production that's coming from shale? Well, it approaches 50% by 2040. So it's a pretty important chunk of the resource base, right? And it accounts for roughly half by 2040 of domestic production. In Europe, I showed you on the picture, there's actually some preliminary assessments of what European shale resource might be. Turns out to be pretty important as well. Doesn't grow quite as dramatically as what we see in North America. That's largely due to the nature of the shale itself. It's a little bit more in terms of the initial assessments that we have access to. It's a little bit more fractured, a little bit higher cost. It actually leads to a little bit slower pace of development, but still it becomes about 25% of total production in Europe by 2040. Really what it does is help to offset declines in conventional basins. Okay. Now LNG imports in the United States. First thing I want you to do is focus on the first basically 2/3 of the picture, because that gets us out to about 2030. It's not much happening. Okay. Really the bottom line is there's a sufficient domestic resource base to really keep LNG a very marginal source of supply into North America for the next 20 years. Now, beyond that, you really start to push the envelope, right? You start to get into a situation where the shale resource starts to become a little bit more costly, and you start to look at those resource development curves that I showed you for other parts of the world, and they look much less expensive, and so you start to see LNG imports rise at that point. But even by the mid-30s, you're only up to about 35% load factors on these facilities. Okay. So where is the LNG going? Because one of the things that we actually also see happening is rapid growth in the LNG market. So that says something, right? If it's not coming to North America, where is it going? Well, largely to Asia and Europe. Asia really is the premium destination, largely because of the tremendous growth rates and demand that are expected there. But also in Europe, and you can see that partly when you look at regional pricing. So what's plotted here is actually the spread between Henry Hub and the national balancing point. Could have done this for multiple points, but I picked these two because these are the two most people are usually familiar with. But what you actually see is that the national balancing point actually increases relative to Henry Hub. So this looks like a negative, right? But it's because it's plotted as Henry Hub minus NBP. So what that means is there's greater and greater incentive for LNG to flow to Europe versus the United States. And lo and behold, that's exactly what you see. You also see it in Asia. I want to note the scale here. This by 2040 sees an Asian, so this is all of Asia, right? So what we've got plotted here is China, India, Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, so on and so forth. China surpasses the Japanese market with regard to being the largest importer of LNG by about 2025, 2026, and continues to grow there on after. But you see a total market size in Asia that's approaching about 29 trillion cubic feet. That is very, very large. But that's basically where the sink is. And with regard to LNG versus pipeline flows in terms of internationally traded gas, LNG surpasses pipeline gas to account for roughly half of all internationally traded gas by about 2030. So markets, one of the things that this really highlights is markets do become increasingly connected. Right? So something that happens in one part of the world will impact everything else, particularly because there is that increasing physical liquidity, right? The ability to move cargoes from point A to point B very, very quickly. On the LNG export front, what this actually signals is that some countries that are really not major players in the LNG game will become so by 2040. Two that I want to highlight because I'm going to come back to them later are Iran, which is this yellow bar here, and Venezuela, which is this white one. Okay. And you'll see why I want to come back to these in a few minutes because I'm going to talk about the scenarios we ran. This is the Qatari LNG export picture. That should not surprise too many people. And this is Australia. In fact, through the mid-2030s, these are by far the two largest LNG exporters in the world. So scenario results. You recall yesterday we talked about the fact that natural gas demand is positively influenced in pretty much every case that we ran using the World Energy Model. What we could actually do is take the results of all the different scenarios we ran using the World Energy Model and develop this relationship between the CO2 price, the natural gas price, and what that means for what we'll call the demand impulse. So how much does natural gas demand actually increase for a given natural gas price and a given CO2 price? And what you see are these two curves. What these curves actually represent are two different gas prices along each curve. So the purple curve, which is the top one, actually represents a gas price of roughly $5 an MCF. The red curve is a $7 price. But going across the horizontal axis here is the price of CO2, going from $0 to $200 a ton. And so one of the things you notice is this is actually what we call a non-monotonic relationship. So as the CO2 price rises initially, you see this surge in gas demand. But as you really begin to push the CO2 price higher and higher, you actually see gas demand begin to fall. And that's largely because as the CO2 price reaches certain hurdles, you actually begin to trigger investments in other types of technology, CCS and coal, for example. So coal will make a comeback as the CO2 price continues to rise. And this is something we touched on yesterday in that conversation. But the point is you can actually use this relationship for an array of CO2 prices to determine, well, what's going to happen to gas demand and therefore run it through the model. And lo and behold, we can do that for all the cases that we ran and you get this spread. All right, I wanted to show you the last picture because this is a little confusing when you look at all the lines on the same chart. Right? But the point is we actually are going to look at three particular cases over the next 3 slides. One is this 50 by 50 with offsets case. That's this light blue line. One is the carbon tax 30 case. That's where you have a carbon tax of $30 and the carbon price is $30 basically for as far as the eye can see. That's this yellow line way up here. Okay? So you get the biggest demand response in that particular case. And then you get the case where you introduce compressed natural gas vehicles such that they represent 30% of the vehicle fleet by 2050. And that's this gray line that really is at the top of all this by 2050, but sort of rising steadily throughout. Okay? So in terms of running all this through the model, you actually end up seeing some very interesting results. One of the things I want to highlight in the top graph, this is the increase in demand relative to the reference case, is in the 50 by 50 case, which is the top one. That's where we have a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050 relative to the 2005 levels. You see demand in the US and Canada are both increased up. Right? That's actually also true for all the Annex 1 countries. So basically all of Europe that are Annex 1 countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Right? So you see this positive impulse. Now the reason I'm highlighting that is because it's different from the other two cases. Because the other two cases are US-only policies. So the first case is going to have a very different impact on LNG flows, international energy markets, than the other two. So that's why I'm raising this point now. In the other two cases, which is the carbon tax 30 and then followed by the CNGV 30 by 50 case, you actually see that U.S. demand is up, Canadian and Mexican demand are slightly down. That's because North American prices are generally higher, and so you see a demand response relative to natural gas demand in those countries because price is higher. So demand is higher. What does that mean? It means we need more supply. So where does it come from? Right? Well, we see in these three graphics, it's coming from LNG, at least partially. So these are the increases in LNG imports by terminal. I know it's difficult to read here, but again, this will all be available online, and it's actually in the paper as well. So. But what you see is the largest increase in LNG imports is in, and this shouldn't be surprising, the carbon tax 30 case. That's where we had the biggest impulse in demand. So we actually do see in the carbon tax 30 case a real push towards natural gas, a movement away from coal, sort of as we discussed yesterday with all the pie charts I was showing. And what this means is that we actually do eventually move to a situation where at the margin we need more and more LNG. It's because we're really pushing our domestic resource base pretty hard. Shale gas production also responds positively. There are some intertemporal responses here. In particular, in the Marcellus Shale, you see some declines in production in the front because you see increases in other places, but then long term, it really comes flooding in. Shale gas production responds pretty similarly in all cases. The biggest response, though, is in the carbon tax 30 case. Again, that should not be that surprising. But on net, what you see is more production from shale. So you see more LNG, but you also do see more domestic production. Right? That's an important thing to point out. Now, I mentioned more LNG, and one of the things I want to remind you of, as I mentioned a minute ago, is in the 50 by 50 case with offsets, this is a policy that's working internationally, in so much as it affects not just the United States, but it also affects all the Annex I countries. So globally, LNG demand is much higher in that case. So you have greater competition for supplies on the water. And so one of the things that you actually see, and this is why I wanted to draw your attention to the yellow, the biggest responder, not just in that case, but in every single case that we ran, is Iran. So what that's actually signaling is if we do something to increase the demand for natural gas, not just within the United States, but internationally, and it results in an increased demand for liquefied natural gas, the supplier at the margin, so the one that benefits the most, in effect, to that demand increase is Iran. And so this is one of those potentially unintended consequences, right, that we sort of need to internalize and think about when we start to think about really pushing the envelope. Now, a major sensitivity in all this, and this is why I highlighted that point at the beginning, is the resource endowment. If you move the resource endowment from 600 trillion cubic feet to 1,200 trillion cubic feet, so you double it, then the outcomes will look dramatically different, right? So there is still uncertainty in that space. So that's really all I have to say with regard to the scenarios we ran. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain those now.
Yeah. In your assumptions on LNG, did you assume that basically all LNG projects produce pretty much all out over the periods?
Initially, they don't, particularly right now, because the way the model works is you hard code initial capacities in, and the model will make commercial decisions, in effect, to develop LNG through those facilities based on what demands are. Longer term, the model actually develops capacities. So to the extent that demand is needed, then you're starting to, you run out of existing capacity, you start to develop new capacity, and they operate at roughly 90%.
Right, okay, because in general, I think as you've discussed and Ed has discussed, LNG is cheaper to produce and then shale, and then once you have it under production, you've got to keep the volume up. So, and with what's happened with contracts are becoming more and more cutting the destination-specific ties so that you, in effect, have floating international pipelines. So the gas is going to go somewhere. It's just now the markets will, also going back to Amy's point, kind of loosely compete with each other because you still have the up to 30% transportation cost differences, but you will get some degree of price competition.
Yes, absolutely, like and it's something I didn't really highlight in the scenarios for lack of time, really, but the arbitrage point globally moves depending on where the demand response is, and so you get different basis differentials across regions that result, and that affects project development, so on and so forth. So.
I wonder if you could help me sort out something on compressed natural gas for vehicles. I'd say the Pickens plan has probably not received the highest praise here. And, it seems to me, well, actually going back looking at the executive summary, you had a comment, I think, that the efficiency of electric vehicles was like three and a half times that of compressed natural gas. But it's going to go into 18-wheelers. I think the Pickens plan is not to have urban commuter vehicles on it. And I recollect that these engines are perhaps 25% efficient. So I don't see how, electric could be that much more efficient well to wheels. And it seems like these are non-competing. That is, electric vehicles are going to be, urban cars and passenger, private cars, whereas CNG is going to go to the 18-wheelers. And that's what, I think, 30% of our total transportation fuel. So,
Yes, he did.
Yes.
I'll talk about that.
Right, yes. Well, in fact, I'm aware of that, but I'm talking about the new plan, which was to get Walmart on.
We didn't test the new plan, we tested the new plan.
Yes, that's right. And, it's by degrees, right? So if we did, 15% compressed natural gas to represent the, heavy vehicle fleet and then the rest electric vehicles, you're talking about something that's going to be an in-between case. So, the net result in both cases is natural gas demand is higher, actually, and that's one of the things we pointed out yesterday. Because even if you push electric vehicles, you're going to use natural gas to fuel those, via the power generation system. So with regard to the efficiencies, the data we had, internal combustion engines roughly 20% efficient. Actually the latest batteries are pushing 86% efficiency. That's even more than 3.5 times. But you're absolutely right. Well to wheels, the numbers are different, right? And that's actually something that we account for in the modeling, because well to wheels you have to account for obviously not only the fuel efficiency of transporting the fuel to its end use, but also and the loss in fuel at processing, so on and so forth, but also in the power generation system, right? The 60% efficiency for if you're assuming new advanced combined cycle units actually handle the load in the electrical system, then you have to account for that as well. So, it does compress the gap, but nevertheless, the well-to-well efficiency is, I think it works out to roughly on the order of 2 times what it is for compressed natural gas. So, that's basically why the numbers work out the way they work out, notwithstanding any sort of technical issues that might be present. But certainly, I mean, we could do intermediate cases, but that wasn't, Another point I want to make, actually, because from the tone of your comments, it seems this way. We're not actually advocating any policies here, right? I mean, the point is to actually look at the cost benefit of every individual policy in some way. And so basically what we're doing is we're saying, look, there are trade-offs no matter what you do, right? And it's just important to understand that, to have actually a really informed debate about the appropriate path forward.
Okay, and I appreciate that comment that you're really trying to be neutral about it. I was just a little concerned about the tone. So thank you very much.
I'd like to make the point, just to sort of bring out and have Ken talk about it a little bit. When you look at these different scenarios, one of the things that I have difficulty with the debate in Washington, right, is people stand up and they say, we have this crisis of global warming and we have to do this. And, the have to do this has cost implications for consumers. The have to do this has national security implications. And the politicians don't tell you the national security implications. So, you do have lobby groups that stand up and say, well, if we pass this tax, electricity prices are going to go up by X. And, we did a little of that. But I find that there is just a lack of interest in thinking about, which is sort of our specialty here at the Baker Institute. I've got a range of 15 policies I can consider. And one of the things we tried to do, and I think the Ken slides show, is if I do policy A versus policy B, and my goal is, and again, I think there's confused goals in Washington. So the first question is my goal to lower my oil use, or is my goal to reduce emissions? Because as I discussed yesterday, this concept that every single policy both lowers my oil use and actually lowers greenhouse gas emissions is incorrect. Okay? So once I recognize that that is incorrect, then I have to ask myself, okay, if the United States is going to lower emissions, and that's our goal, we're an environmental nation, and our key goal is to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And Joe Barnes is going to talk about this after the coffee break. If I'm going to be part of a global regime or I'm not going to be part of a global regime, if I'm going to pass a carbon tax in the United States, and I'm not going to force China or India or Europe or anybody else to pass this carbon tax, and the end result is going to be that I'm going to re-strengthen Iran, Venezuela, and Russia against the national interest for the United States, the security of Europe, then, was that really worth the cost, given how much we're going to reduce U.S. emissions? And the thing that this study does, and I understand in the press they're saying, the Baker Institute says we should do this, or the Baker Institute says we should do that. There are no statements about that in this study. What we are trying to tell you is, if you're thinking about U.S. national interest, and there are 5 policies you can take independently, unilaterally, without our allies, and they're going to substantially weaken our allies and ourselves in the global system, you know, we have to give that serious consideration in thinking about greenhouse gas policy. And if we're going to do that, and it's only going to lower our emissions by 5% or 10% or 15%, when scientists are saying we need a 50% reduction in emissions, you know, is it worth doing it to lower emissions by 8% if it's going to strengthen the geopolitics of petro producers and resource nationalism? And that's really where I think that the debate really needs to be. And that is why we have a paper on the history of US-OPEC relations, because I think you really need to go back to what Nixon did, to what Kissinger tried to do, to what Ed did when he was in the administration. And I politely didn't mention the Synfuels project and how many billions of dollars we spent on that to have no progress whatsoever, because you're talking about real money. And we're not in an economically strong position right now, so we really can't afford to spend, you know, how much do we spend on Synfuels, Ed? Do you remember? $10 billion? $20 billion. So we spent $20 billion on Synfuels, right, in you know, 1970-something dollars. And it was a policy that produced nothing. Right? And that's really what we're trying to show in these trade-offs, right? Which is not that this wouldn't lower emissions, but taken outside of a global emissions agreement, you know, what is it going to mean for the strength of China, strength of Russia, strength of Iran in the global system?
I don't have anything to add to that. It was very well said. Cal.
Yeah, Ken, I really enjoyed your talk there. It's pretty provocative in a lot of ways. People will talk a lot about the supply of natural gas and how much of a volume of resource might be available. I thought you did a really nice job of explaining that it's a very fluid number right now. I would like to just point out to everybody in this room that shale gas is a lot like what oil might have been in 1950. When people looked at the offshore and said, how are we going to do it? Well, there are sedimentary basins offshore all over the place. Some of them are very attractive for shale gas. Right now, the economics of that is pretty stupid. Nobody would do it. But shale gas is developing pretty fast in many ways. It's learning how to do it much more efficiently and cheaper. This industry in a low gas environment right now is truly hell-bent on lowering cost. My company is one of the biggest shale gas producers in North America, and driving costs down is our #1 mission. And I think we're also learning how we can do shale gas from platforms, not yet offshore platforms, but platforms onshore. And there are a lot of tricks there. As soon as we learn to do that and move it offshore, we will greatly increase the potential volumes of natural gas that can be economically recovered and used in the world. And that will change the whole geopolitical situation too. And it just might turn out that America is a lot more fortunate than you think.
Yeah, just to highlight the point that Cal's making, because it's actually a very good one, and that's why I noted the uncertainty in the resource base and how it's been increasing over time in terms of what's a generally accepted estimate. And in fact, the costs of developing these things have been changing over time dramatically too. And that's why in this slide, when I showed you what we actually have in our model with regard to the North American resource base, there's this arrow, and maybe I didn't highlight it well enough. But if we actually see an increase in what's accepted as technically recoverable, or we see a decrease in costs over time, the direction of that blue line is going to start to, trend to look more like the FSU and more like the Middle East over time. And so that's something we have to sort of keep in mind when we think about these scenarios. And certainly if you take a very optimistic view, then everything that I just said is abated to some extent, at least pushed out maybe a decade, 2 decades. But the bottom line is, unless we can actually get to a point in North America where the resource base basically looks like that red line or that green line, we can expect at some point to see an increase in imports. So.
What is the policy that would move the blue line to the red line?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no debate about that whatsoever?
I think some of the proposed changes in the tax code is detrimental to that goal. So.
Yeah, I noticed that among all your scenarios, because of the adequacy of the resource on the front end of the curve, that the first couple of decades, it seems like the dominoes are pretty much laid up and are going to fall largely in a certain way, and then they diverge pretty radically for the next couple of decades. I was just wondering what your perspective is on the first couple of decades. What really matters in that time frame that could shake up the apple cart, and what creates the greatest diversity in the first couple of decades?
Probably lots of different things, just to answer that question in a really sort of simple and unsophisticated way. But largely, the reason largely you don't see a lot of change in the first couple of decades is not just because the dominoes are stacked up, but because in the scenarios we ran, you really don't start to see significant impacts. Say in the carbon tax 30 case, the demand starts to rise gradually, but you really don't hit that peak until 15 years from now, 20 years from now, and that's when you've, over time, gradually started to eat through the resource base, and it's pretty constant cost, for a pretty long period of time. It's a pretty flat supply curve is the point. Things that could upset the apple cart, I think one of the biggest uncertainties on the North American side is regulation. I mentioned some of the proposed changes to the tax code to raise revenues for the federal government. I think that could really have a dramatic impact on the pace of development in the shale resource base. What is the EPA report that Ed mentioned that's actually going to be finalized in 2012 find with regard to hydraulic fracturing, and what sort of new regulations are put in place as a result of that? I think that could have a dramatic impact. What sort of steps might state regulatory agencies take to limit access to certain areas because of concerns about watershed contamination? I mean, that could really upset the apple cart. So, there's a lot of different things, but everything I'm pointing to really is of the regulatory variety. So I think that's really the biggest uncertainty on the horizon.
And you can have to the flip side, what are the real regulations going to pull, and how fast are they going to play?
Well, that's obviously important, yeah. Yeah, that's a demand side push, though.
Internationally, going back to something that Ed was talking about, Europe, I think another interesting one is what might happen with Iraq.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even talk about that. You're right. It's actually something we've been noticing with this model for quite a while. I think the first time we rolled it out was at a conference in Istanbul, and we had some very interesting conversations after the presentation with representatives from BOTAŞ. It's a Turkish pipeline company, because they said, I'm glad somebody else sees this in effect, because they've been negotiating with the Iraqis to move gas through Turkey to Europe for a long time. And you're starting to see it more and more in the trade press as this being discussed as a real viable option to make Nabucco go. Yes, the Iraqi wild card is a major wild card in all of this.
Okay.
Yep. Great, absolutely.
Okay, well, now that everybody's had a cup of coffee, the theme today is provocative, and it's always fun to introduce our next speaker. Joe Barnes had a long and illustrious career in the U.S. Department of State. He was stationed in some very challenging places. I like to tell, maybe Joe wouldn't appreciate the story, but his first job in the State Department was to try to find World War II war criminals applying for visas to the United States and deal with their families who were horrified that they couldn't come here. And from that, he went on to work in the Sudan and Saudi Arabia and some other very difficult posts for U.S. diplomats. But we are very pleased that once he was inside the civil world of the State Department in Washington, D.C., somebody figured out that he was an incredible writer, and he became both the advance man and the speechwriter for Secretary Baker. And then came with Secretary Baker here to the Institute back when Joe and I and Ambassador Region were in 2 tiny rooms in Fondren Library. So we have worked together for a long time. He is the Bonner Means Baker Fellow here at the Institute, and his specialty is U.S. foreign policy. and he is going to bring us back to a topic we started discussing yesterday afternoon, but is a very interesting aspect to this question, which, Bob, I think you'll enjoy hearing more about, which is this whole concept of U.S. trade and the possible border tariff that might be part of any kind of a global climate agreement that the United States would agree to. Joe?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm routinely asked by Amy to speak at events, and I'm not sure it has anything to do with my particular competence, but with the fact that I speak very quickly and tend to end before my time. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. This is not because I cannot do PowerPoint. This is because I choose not to do PowerPoint. I'm going to make a presentation today that is rather less organized than is my wont. It's because much of the material that I was intending to discuss was addressed yesterday by Dr. Stavins, I believe, from Harvard. And I had one of those excruciating moments while I was sitting in my chair listening to him talk and realizing not only was he covering much of the material that I intended to do so today, but that he was doing so far better than I will. So I will just touch upon a few subjects, including the failure of cap and trade in the United States, the prospects for some sort of a future comprehensive approach in the United States, potential impact, comprehensive approach to greenhouse gas emissions, the possible impact of the failure of cap and trade in terms of ongoing international efforts, and end up with a couple cautionary notes, I suppose, on discussions of U.S. national interest. Let me begin by saying that cap and trade is dead. It's not only dead, but to quote the Wizard of Oz, it's very, very dead. There will be an energy bill introduced in the fall. Majority Leader Reid has so suggested. There will be no cap and trade in it. There may be a renewable energy portfolio standard included. I note that just last week, a number of senators said that they would be introducing, I think, separate legislation on a renewable energy portfolio. Whether or not that would be melded into broader energy legislation is unclear at this point. But the group of senators who supported it have said they will support the portfolio include a number of Republicans, interestingly, and they include Brownback, Collins, Ensign, and Bingaman. Bingaman is the Democrat in the bunch. Basically mandate the utility source 15% of output from renewable sources by 2021. Other than a renewable energy portfolio or other renewable standards, I hold out a little expectation for whatever energy bill emerges. There'll be some discussion of offshore drilling and probably some subsidies and tax breaks, maybe for improving home energy efficiency, and maybe some for converting buses and things like that to natural gas. In other words, the energy bill is most likely to look much like the energy bills that we've seen over recent years, which is, to be quite blunt, despite the individual merit of some of the provisions, usually tend to be sort of a grab bag of subsidies and tax breaks. Ed Morse wisely said we have no international energy policy. I might go a step further and say that we have no energy policy at all. The blame game has already begun about the failure of cap and trade. Ed mentioned the importance of the offshore disaster, the BP spill. Surely it did play a part in the failure of cap and trade. I have read that The hope was by opening up offshore drilling, the president might be able to attract a number of Republicans to the bill, but that when the BP disaster occurred, he realized that he would lose Democrats on the other end of the spectrum because of the spill, so that he found himself in an untenable position. But let's talk about the blame game. After all, we are Americans, and like all Americans, we are less interested in solving problems and more interested in allocating blame. So what are some of the reasons that have been floated? Lack of presidential leadership, partisanship, particularly in the U.S. Senate. Cap and trade bill did pass the House, although by a very narrow margin. Cap and trade is roundly detested by the Tea Party movement. I will note that I saw an article a few days ago saying that none of the Republicans running for the Senate this term, including John McCain, have expressed support for significant climate change legislation. Many of the Republicans running for the U.S. Senate are climate change skeptics. Several of them, I think O'Donnell is one, Miller is another, and maybe Sharon Angle are outright deniers of anthropogenic climate change. There's the usual suspects, lobbyists, legislative fatigue. I think Ed may have mentioned this in passing. We did, this comes at the end of a congressional session that included a stimulus and health care reform and financial reform. An argument floated yesterday, and I think with a great deal of wisdom, is that during a recession, people's priorities change. And more generally, a declining belief in anthropogenic climate change. If you read our paper, which I co-wrote with James Cohn here, there's a great deal of data on polling. Americans are more skeptical about climate change than Europeans. American belief in and concern about climate change has declined in recent years, and the partisan gap has widened. Did ClimateGate and other stories about climate change, have they affected the polling? At one level, the answer is no. When polled about what they know about the East Anglia University ClimateGate scandal, most people knew nothing. On the other hand, the ClimateGate scandal and other concerns about IPCC findings may well have fed into a general sense that the science perhaps was not as settled as people had once thought. One of the things that is interesting, and when you look at the polling, and I think it's true of many areas, is responses are immensely sensitive to the wording of the question. So you can get all sorts of numbers on do people support cap and trade or not, depending on how you ask the question. You also get very strange results, like the people who there's a non-trivial number of Americans that do not believe that there is any anthropogenic climate change going on, but nonetheless support a cap and trade system. I'm just pointing out that I think we can make two useful general statements, though, which is Americans are more skeptical about climate change than Western Europeans, and that they are more skeptical probably today than they were 2 or 4 years ago. What led to the demise of cap and trade legislation in the Senate? Probably all of the above. To be quite honest, neither James nor I were convinced, even as we began this project, that the votes were there to reach the 60-vote threshold in the U.S. Senate. The House vote on Waxman-Markey was very close, 219 to 212. The number of Democrats from coal-producing states was always going to be a problem. Jay Rockefeller is a case in point. And it became increasingly unclear which Republicans, if any, would actually come along. After the election, during the election, and then afterwards, McCain basically turned his back on his previous support of climate change legislation. And Lindsey Graham played what I can only describe, and I say this with all due respect to Senator Graham, he sort of played the role as a legislative tease for about 6 months, showing a little bit of leg and then hitching down his pants, and then showing a little bit more leg and hitching down the pants. All I can say is that he survived it with his virtue intact, and he abandoned a comprehensive cap and trade. I think that the likelihood of a cap and trade regime in the United States in the near future drops to 0 or close to it. Republicans are likely to pick up seats in November. I'd put their odds of winning the House, after reading some polls, is probably better than 50-50. And I'm a site I read today, which is the Nate Silver site at the New York Times blog. He does a great deal of analysis of polls. Has the Democrats holding on to maybe 52, 53 seats in the Senate, although a Republican takeover isn't by no means impossible. There is simply no political incentive for Republicans to agree to cap and trade. It is a tax, as we are told. And although we may see a better political environment in 2013 for cap and trade, I would not at all be sure that's the case. It's going to be a long time, in my opinion, before Democrats have 60 seats in the Senate. Again, it was a very anomalous set of circumstances that they actually attained that level. Then there is, of course, the alternative of a broad-based carbon tax. I've actually heard people in the wake of the failure of cap and trade, there's actually been people saying, well, now we need to get serious and push through a carbon tax. I'm not here to discuss the relative merits of a carbon tax versus a cap and trade regime, but all I can tell you is that if the chance of a cap and trade regime approaches 0 over the next couple of years, the idea of a comprehensive, explicit carbon tax is 0 over the next couple of years. A note on the comparisons here, and this is a sort of an aside, but one that I frequently make, which is it's never quite fair to compare a theoretical tax or some other fiscal regime with an actual piece of legislation. Whatever one thinks about a carbon tax, comprehensive carbon tax, by the time it emerged from the U.S. House and Senate, it would not be the beautiful, streamlined, clean model that our economist friends have so wisely prepared for us and so avidly supported. That's not to say it would not be a good idea, right, or that it wouldn't be better than cap and trade, but it will surely be a very ugly piece of legislation with exemptions and exclusions and deductions and averaging and grandfathering clauses and the 1,000 things that happen in the course of every piece of legislation. This, by the way, is a constant problem in discussing tax reform, where invariably you have somebody comparing a streamlined theoretical tax against an actual tax. It's not a very useful comparison. So where does this leave us right now in terms of going forward? Let me discuss, first of all, briefly, the international aspect. It's going to be very, very difficult to meet Obama's pledge that he made at Copenhagen. Very, very difficult under the best of circumstances. That includes fairly stringent and aggressive action by the EPA and fairly aggressive action by states. And we're going to hear more about the EPA later, and I'm looking forward to that. It's a clear blow to U.S. leadership in global climate change, and it will make it on the margins more difficult to get concessions from countries like China and India in terms of some sort of formula to get us somewhere near a quantitative limit. Last but not least, I will note that the failure of cap and trade has undermined perhaps Obama's clearest break with past U.S. foreign policy. I intend to, at some point in the near future, write a paper discussing precisely how mainstream Obama foreign policy is in most areas. But the one area where there was a clear break, even from the second term of the Bush administration, was in the area of global climate change. That looks fairly tarnished right now. I will note in something having a little slight irony that the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to President Obama in its citation mentioned climate change because, of course, even earlier on he had made climate change a top priority. One of the great ironies of the Nobel Prize citation. Let me now discuss a couple smaller, not necessarily smaller, but not quite fully covered issues. One of which is the one sort of suggested yesterday by Dr. Harris, which is the whole question of some border adjustment to deal with embedded carbon. The House legislation included a provision that gave the president some discretion in this area. I'm not sure whether Carrie Lieberman did or did not, but I do know that one of the sponsors said that they would include such a provision at some point. Let me stipulate that coming up with some sort of border adjustment will be difficult on technical grounds and open to abuse and political grounds. And because it can clearly be used for protectionist purposes that have nothing to do with the issue at hand. I will make, however, 2 points. One of which is there is a strong case for capturing embedded carbon in any carbon tax regime or any cap and trade regime, particularly as a means to encourage other countries to join a comprehensive international regime. And to be quite blunt, the chance of major cap and trade legislation ever passing in the United States without such a provision is impossible to imagine. Let me just end up quickly by saying, looking at the international arena, there are a lot of problems with the UN approach. I think that we might want to consider possibilities of finding other fora in which to pursue agreement. Moise Naim at Foreign Policy refers to something as minilateralism, which is to find the smallest number of countries required to address an important issue. I think that global climate change may well be that, an issue where this is appropriate. There's something that Obama developed called the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Environment. 17 countries belong, and they represent between them 80–90% of world emissions. We may need to start looking at fora other than entirely UN-centered. In conclusion, let me just mention one last thing, which is that, and once again this falls under cautionary note, be very, very careful. We're at an energy conference, right? And Amy mentioned this briefly in one of her comments recently. There is a tendency among people that study energy to believe that every decision you made by the U.S. government is driven by energy. It is not. Our energy policy reflects a host of other factors and other interests in U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's wise to remember this as we look to the future. All things considered, energy is not the #1 priority of the United States government today. There are other considerations and other matters, and that the United States government has routinely, since the end of World War II, subordinated its energy interests to broader foreign policy goals. And this should neither be surprising, nor should it be necessarily sinister. But we should bear it in mind as we go forward. I love the prize by Dan Yergin, but it sort of embodies what I call the energy rules the world theory. Well, energy is a very important thing, but it's not the only thing in U.S. foreign policy, and we make analytic mistakes when we forget this. Thank you. Time for, do I have a question? I don't know, question? Any questions? Can I say something outrageous then? Look, can you answer this question real quick, and then I'll answer yours. Does the United States government want higher hydrocarbon prices or lower hydrocarbon prices? You know what the answer is? Yes. Right, Ed? No? It's true. Anyway, he was talking about the contradictions, right? We want both.
Hi, Joshua Shank from the Bipartisan Policy Center. I have a question about the carbon tax that you put the chances of it zero. Do you think that the President's Deficit Commission could have any impact on that scenario, given if they were able to actually get 14 out of 18 votes to recommend a carbon tax? So, in other words, does the debt reduction strategy change the carbon tax?
Well, maybe, except for the fact, as far as according to a report this morning, the Republican members of the Deficit Commissions to date have refused to agree to any revenue-enhancing measures within international deliberations. So as far as we know, to date, the Republican members of that commission have not agreed to any revenue-enhancing measure. And perhaps, to my mind, if they're going to enhance revenues on that side of things, they'll find the least transparent way to do so, right? And the transparency goes this way: carbon tax, cap and trade, EPA and other regulation and subsidies. And EPA regulation and subsidies outpolls cap and trade outpolls carbon tax, right? In other words, the population likes the least transparent and least efficient of the options. Another?
I'm not very much surprised to hear that cap and trade is dead. I hope it will be revived, but for the moment, I'm not very surprised to hear that cap and trade is dead, because it's only one tool to attain the goal. I have two questions. One, according to the analysis of World Resources Institute, even without the cap and trade system, the sort of target which President Obama committed at Copenhagen could be realized on the basis of Clean Air Act. Well, I think with many kinds of regulations. And do you think that is possible? So even when our cap and trade system is dead, it doesn't matter seriously for the moment if it is going to be revived at a certain point. Secondly, well, it's rather straightforward question. I think even if the interest of the problems of climate change is rather declining among the general public, still I hope the Obama administration has a great interest in realizing that, and that understanding is correct. It's my question to you, the second one. Thank you.
I mean, the second one, your question is what? I mean, is...
Are they still serious about that, and the other administration?
I think, like all administrations, they are wary of political defeat. And that's why there was never a vote on cap and trade in the U.S. Senate. And until the political climate changes, I don't think there's going to be the administration, whatever its desires, will just, you know what I mean, will just bide their time and do their best. That, which leads us to the marginal question, which is, there's a nice study by the World Resources Institute, for instance. It discusses various ways in which EPA regulation and other federal regulation in place can conceivably get us close to Obama's target under the best case. And we're going to hear some people from the EPA, and so this is an interesting issue. I will say just this. It's just not a very efficient way to go about doing business. It's a bit like taking a sledgehammer. You know what I mean? It's if you were looking for an optimal way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you wouldn't use new plant regulations. You'd want a flexible system that assesses basically comes up with a carbon price on the broadest possible basis to discourage consumption and increase investment in lower carbon or non-carbon. There is things I would put this what you're talking about, and I'll say this with due respect to our EPA representatives later. It's a second or third best solution to the problem. But hey, at least it's not a seventh best. But I know of no. Peter Hartley, you might know. I know of no economists that think this is a more efficient way. It's just, it's just a really inefficient way of getting around this problem, and it basically is what it reflects is a failure in our political system. That's all it means, and I don't mean that's a failure in the sense that I support cap and trade legislation. We're now in the situation where cap and trade legislation has failed, and then the EPA is going to be trying to get the same result. I mean, there's something bizarre about a political system where that's what happens. But I think it's mainly expressive of political failure. That it? Thank you.
Okay, our last presentation of the morning takes us to a more international perspective on the same issues. The Baker Institute has had an incredibly fruitful research collaboration with the Energy Institute of Japan, Institute for Energy Economics of Japan, for 15 years. And for many of those years, even though he looks very young, we have had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Kobayashi, who is our next presenter. Every year he produces a more and more interesting paper. I think he is probably one of the up-and-coming top researchers in Japan on international issues. In our national oil company study, his paper on Saudi strategies toward Arab heavy crude have turned out to be prescient, because the Saudis are now doing exactly what Dr. Kobayashi predicted in his brilliant slides, and U.S. refiners on the Gulf Coast are being cut, something he predicted 5 years ago. So he is the leader of the oil group at the Institute for Energy Economics in Japan, and previously he worked at Tonen General Seikyu, a ExxonMobil affiliated company. So started with a little bit of industry background, and he has a BA from Hitotsubashi University and an MA from SAIS in Washington, D.C. My colleague, Dr. Kobayashi.
Thank you for the introduction. Maybe my presentation file has not been ready yet. I like to use PowerPoint file for my presentation, by the way. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Baker Institute for giving this great opportunity to speak in this great setting. I feel very honored to be the prominent speakers of this great conference. And the title of my presentation is Carbon Management in Asia and the Role of US and Japan. So I'd like to talk about if my presentation file is ready, I'd like to start with the energy demand and the carbon emission outlook, which was done by our institute. And then I will talk about what the Asian countries are doing in terms of carbon management, with particular examples from Japan, China, and India. And then I will conclude my presentation, what US and Japan can do in the carbon management in Asia. Maybe my presentation file hasn't been ready yet. The points in the introduction part of my presentation is that, like other energy demand and carbon emission outlook, Asia will be the key in the world energy supply and the demand balance and the carbon management in the coming years. But we did scenario analysis in our energy demand and carbon emissions outlook. Although the number of scenarios is not so many as the Baker Institute did, we did a scenario called Advanced Technology Case in our energy demand outlook. And we expect that if we could adopt the best available technology in the most progressive manner, we can peak out our carbon emissions at around 2030. But in that effort, CCS will be the key role in controlling our carbon emissions outlook, which means, okay, here's ready. Doesn't move. Okay, what I'm talking about this slide, this is a comparison of the CO2 emissions between the reference case and the advanced technology case. As I said, we can peak out the carbon emissions at around 2030 if we could adopt the best available technology in the most progressive manner. But please note that CCS will be the key technology in our analysis. And as of 2035, almost 20% of the carbon reduction will be achieved by CCS. So without CCS, we expect that the carbon emissions just continue to grow in the coming years. This is a comparison of the world CO2 emissions. And this is a comparison of the Asia's CO2 emissions. Overall picture is same, but you may notice that the share of energy saving is larger than the world case. So always energy saving or energy efficiency improvement plays a key role in mitigating the carbon emissions, but this is particularly so in case of Asia. So what I'd like to highlight here is 2 points. To manage carbon emission in Asia is a key, is the most important thing to address the global climate change issues. And among that efforts, energy saving will be the most important measure. Then I'd like to talk about what Japan and other Asian countries are doing in terms of carbon management. Japanese government prepares a so-called basic energy plan, which is a fundamental policy document for Japanese energy policies. And this document is prepared every 3 years. And we had the latest plan in June this year. In terms of carbon management, the government set the target as of the 2030 about the share of zero-emission power source, which includes nuclear, hydro, and other renewables. The current share of zero-emission power source is 34%, but the government intends to double the share to the 70%. Majority of the increase will come from nuclear, but we also work hard to have more renewables such as solar and wind. And we also aim to halve carbon emissions from the residential sector, which we see continuous growth in terms of carbon emissions. And we also like to maintain the current competitive state in terms of energy efficiency in the industrial sector. And in the plan, there are lots of policy measures mentioned, which I never have enough time to explain. But recently, the focus of the measure is on the how energy companies can do in terms of carbon management. Last year, we have a new law called the Act of Energy Supply System Sophistication. This translation is a little bit tricky, but this is the direct translation from Japanese to English. There are two objectives in this law. The first one is the use of non-fossil fuels. The another one is to use fossil fuels more efficiently. Regarding the use of non-fossil fuels, each oil company has to blend biofuels to a certain share in the gasoline supply. The number of the biofuels is not that significant compared to those in the US or in Europe. But please note that we do not have a domestic biofuel source. So most of the biofuel will be imported either from Brazil or other countries. And the gas suppliers also have to recover and utilize of the biogas, which was generated from sewage treatment. We are still in the stage of evaluation whether this is commercially possible or not. But the gas suppliers are also required to have some portion of non-fossil fuels. And the power company has to raise the share of the non-fossil fuel power supply to 50% by 2020. I mentioned that the target of the non-fossil fuel power generation is 70% as of 2030. So this is a kind of midterm target in terms of the non-fossil fuel power supply. Regarding the efficient utilization of fossil fuels, oil company has to raise the share of the conversion capacity, which includes the residual FCC and coker, to 13% of the total crude distillation capacity. And gas suppliers, about a certain size of the corporate, have to recover all boil-off gas from LNG receiving capacity terminals by 2020. Like US, we are also discussing climate change bill. The goals of the climate change bill is to reduce the GHG emissions by 25% by 2020. And we also have a long-term target to reduce it by 80% by 2050. As the reduction measures, emission tradings, taxation, and feed-in tariff are included. The law was submitted to the Diet May this year, and it passed the lower house. But there's no sufficient time to discuss this law in the upper house. So the law was discarded in June this year. But the bill will be submitted to the Diet in the next session of the Diet. That's about what Japan is doing in carbon management. I'd like to talk about China. China set the target of CO2 emissions per GDP, which is 40 to 45% reduction by 2020. This is a kind of midterm target. They don't have a short-term target, but they're going to have a National Congress next month. So I expect that Chinese Communist Party will discuss the short-term target of the CO2 emissions per GDP by 2015, which I believe will be 20 or 25% decreased reduction. In order to achieve this target is the most important target for Chinese carbon management. To achieve this target, they are taking various measures. The first one is to improve energy efficiency. Under the current 5-year plan from 2006 to 2010, they have a target of the energy efficiency improvement by energy intensity of GDP by 20%. And as shown in the slide, they did a very good job until the 2007. They improved by 10% in 2 years. But the financial crisis happened, and the Chinese government did a massive economic stimulus package. So the improvement stalled from the year 2008. And as of the end of first half of this year, the improvement is only 14%. So they need to improve by another 6% in 6 months. So 1% per month. This is very challenging, but I understand that the Chinese government committed very seriously to achieve this target. So I believe that they may take some drastic measures to achieve this target in the fourth quarter of this year, like ordering industrial sector to stop the operations or to have more strict traffic control. Chinese government won't make their GHG emissions target internationally credible to avoid severe international criticism. So they definitely want to achieve their capacity they want to show the capacity to achieve this kind of target. And China is also working hard to install more non-fossil fuel power generation capacity, which seems very ambitious to me. But they plan to double the hydropower generation capacity in the next decade, and they want to increase by the order of 8 or 10 times of the wind power generation capacity in the next decade. Of course, this requires a massive capital and extensive development of the nationwide grid system. Natural gas, like in the US, has caught a big attention in China these days. China heavily depends on coal in its power mix and energy mix. But under the current international natural gas market, they have increasingly interested in to have more natural gas in their energy portfolio. And indeed, the government official mentioned that the share of natural gas to be raised to 10% from the current 3 or 4% in the next 10 years. And that may result in 46 million LNG tons imports in 2020, which is, I guess, 5 or 6 times from the current level of imports. China is also interested in efficient vehicles. This policy is not thought only for the purpose of carbon management, but for the industrial policy to have a competitive auto industry in China. The government encourages the people to have smaller and more efficient vehicles by taxation or subsidies. And the government sets the target with the manufacturing and commercialization of so-called next-generation vehicles like hybrid or electricity vehicles. the share of the HV and EV over total auto manufacturing to be raised to 20% and 10% as of 2015. And also the number of ownership of HV and EV to be raised to 3 million and 1.5 million as of 2015, respectively. That is what China is doing, and I will quickly cover what India is doing. As you know, India is the fourth largest carbon emitter in the world, and emissions from power sector particularly has been rapidly increasing these days because coal is the largest source of the power fuel in India, like in China. They also have the target of carbon emissions per GDP, but the size of the reduction target is almost half of the Chinese target, 20 to 25% by 2020. In terms of carbon management in India, the country's efforts still lags compared to China. But what they're currently seriously working is to improve the energy efficiency. What they're doing now is, in order to promote energy efficiency, you need to understand what amount of energy you are using. But India, there's no well-developed objective statistics of energy consumption. So at first they have to develop the statistical database, and then they will develop an energy balance. And also they are interested in setting an efficiency standard and labeling system, which I think US also has. But statistical data development takes time, and different government ministries are involved in this effort, so there's no coherency in the policies, and energy prices subsidized, and so many issues still remain in promoting energy efficiency improvement in India. India is also working to have more non-fossil fuel energy. They have a big potential of the wind and small-sized hydropower generation. And the government set the target of those renewable energy share of the newly added power generation capacities. And the feed-in tariff has been already introduced in several locations. And the nuclear, they plan to increase the current capacity from 4 gigawatt to the 20 gigawatt in the next 10 years. And as you know, US and India has already made agreement with the Nuclear Power Generation Energy Corporation 2 years ago. And Japan also started discussion of a similar agreement this year. Let's skip. So that's what the Asian countries are doing in terms of carbon management. I'd like to move on to what US and Japan can do very briefly. As I mentioned in the early slide, CO2 emission reduction in Asia is key to address global climate change issues. So US and Japan, as an advanced nation, should assume leadership or take some responsibility in carbon management in Asia. And indeed, US and Japan have a number of common interests in carbon management in the region. First, because there are lots of large room to the improvement of energy efficiency, we have lower cost carbon emission reduction and credit opportunities in the region. And second, because we do US, Japan, and Asia, not including European or African countries, we may be able to have a more effective and pragmatic carbon management framework development with a smaller number of countries. Asia-Pacific Partnership, APP, can be a good platform for such framework development. And third, if we could succeed in carbon management and energy demand management, that will lead to the energy market stability in Asia. So that is another good point. And a fourth point is, although I didn't explain in detail, US and Japan has done a lot of bilateral cooperation in China and India. So we have accumulated some success and failure, best practice and issues. Now it's time for us to share those findings from our experiences. That is the fourth common interest. And this is my conclusion. What the US and Japan should pursue. Firstly, we should continue the existing support, which we agreed in the Copenhagen Accord. And then we will start discussions for long-term support for developing countries, including Asian countries. And I believe in the next COP meeting held in Cancun, Mexico, this issue, climate change finance, will be a major agenda in the meeting. And the second one is I mentioned earlier, we can share our experience each other. And the third one is I emphasize that the energy efficiency improvement is key and the most important measure to manage carbon emissions. But in order to measure carbon emission, we need to have an objective system to measure the GHG emissions. So US and Japan can cooperate to develop jointly so-called MRV system, measurable, reportable, and verifiable system for the GHG emissions in Asia. And finally, we can cooperate to set common standards for the advanced energy-related infrastructure and appliances. By having such common standards, will promote the wider deployment of those infrastructure and appliances. So that is my formal presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Any questions?
I see that nuclear power is going to be very important for Japan's future, and recently I saw news that Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is going to be developing fast neutron reactors for commercial production. So I was wondering what you see as we pass 2050, what proportion of nuclear power will be from U-235 and what proportion will be from plutonium. And I assume China's, is going the same direction, so the same question would apply to China. Will they also be doing fast breeder reactors?
In terms of the share of nuclear power generation, we expect that 40% or more, that is the government official target as of 2030. And the component of the nuclear power generation is not mentioned in the government plan, so I don't know which technology they're going to take. But regarding the nuclear power generation, the biggest issue is not about technology, it's siting and safety issue in case of Japan. Because we have some not very good performance in nuclear power generation, although this is somewhat exaggerated by media. To have acceptance from the local community and local community and local government will be the key to raise the share of the nuclear power generation. Regarding the China, unfortunately, I'm not a specialist in nuclear power generation. I do not have a specific knowledge about the technology to be deployed in the Chinese market. But I understand that every manufacturer of nuclear power generation reactors is eyeing the Chinese market because simply the size of increase is immense. But if we look at the history of other areas of the manufacturing business, like refinery and the energy gasification terminal, initially they need foreign companies' involvement, but they gradually learn how to build those infrastructure and facilities. So I believe China will have in refining sector, they have their own licenses. They do not use oil majors license in many. They use some oil majors license in processing, but basically they're using their own license in refining facilities. So that will happen in the nuclear power generation in the future, I think.
Okay, I just wanted to check then, but the news is correct that Mitsubishi Heavy Industry will commercialize fast breeder reactors by 2050. Is that? I mean, that's the news. I just wanted to know if that is correct, huh?
Unfortunately, I haven't heard that news, so I cannot say it's correct. But in terms of the time length from now on, maybe that may be correct.
All right, thank you very much.
Actually, I have a follow-up on nuclear. In our modelling work, the part of the world that seemed to have the greatest growth in nuclear was actually Southeast Asia. Have you sort of looked at any of what the sort of forecasts about what you think might happen in Southeast Asia? Because that's also going to have big energy growth, we think, in the next.
Yeah. We are doing now another energy demand outlook currently. And it will be published in, I think, 1st of November. And in that outlook, we absolutely include that our foreign forecast of the increase of nuclear power generation. For this outlook, unfortunately, I do not have a figure for the capacity of nuclear power generation. But you're very correct that in Southeast Asian countries, very much interested in nuclear power generation, and Vietnam is currently the most is a country which Japan is very interested in to sell their reactors and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, one more question? Oh, we have one more question.
This question is not necessarily addressed to you, but any of the other experts that we have here. A lot of talk about greenhouse gas emissions targets, but I'm really very curious about what the state of affairs is as far as the actual measurement and reporting. And is this a case of the inmates sort of guarding the asylum or running the asylum? Is it just self-reporting basically, or what is the state of affairs of when countries report that their emissions intensity of the economy, for example, in China, is declining? I mean, what is the basis or measurement of that?
In case of China, Chinese government publishes the statistical data for the related issues. But in case of India, as I mentioned, that their statistical database has not been well developed. So yes, they say that India will reduce carbon emissions per GDP by 20% or 25%. But the objective way to measure the emissions has not been well developed. So it's a kind of simultaneous effort to develop statistical data, and at the same time, they are they're making efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And maybe some other specialists.
I mean, it just seems to me that this whole thing kind of has maybe a very weak foundation. So a lot of conversation about something that is resting on something that is so weak to begin with. So I mean, I just wonder if a lot of these things aren't rendered moot because of how we, or if we.
So that may be a part of the reason why they do not show a commitment of the absolute size of the carbon emission. They only mention the carbon emission per GDP. because they cannot know the current state of the absolute amount of carbon emission, how they generate it from their energy consumption. So not much discussed, but statistical database development is very important. It's a starting point of the carbon emissions, and not many countries have developed such a well-developed database. That is another big issue, which is not often discussed.
So let me just recommend to you the paper by Dr. Harris that's out here on our publications table that addresses these issues and some of the scientific methodology that's being put forward and the debate about that methodology. So we do have a paper that goes into that in detail. So as the Nigerian oil minister said when she arrived yesterday, she brought this incredibly good weather. And so you've all been very patient, especially the 2-dayers who are here for both days, asking great questions and participating with us. And so we have a special surprise today for lunch. We have set the tables up outside on the plaza around the fountain because it's really beautiful out. So we are going to have an outdoor picnic lunch, not picnic in the sense that we have the same caterer as yesterday, so it'll be very good food. And let's see, we are 12:15. Let us come back here at 1:15 to start the next session. Thank you very much.